It started not with a whisper, but with a declaration the era of America being taken advantage of is over. With a pen stroke and a tariff list, Donald Trump promised to bring factories roaring back, force foreign powers to bend to American terms, and rewrite the rules of global trade. But in every war, military or economic, the first shots are the easiest to fire. The harder question is, when the smoke clears, will the gains outweigh the casualties? The story of Trump's trade war begins not in the quiet chambers of a trade negotiation room, but in the rally halls and press briefings where a promise was made in bold, unmistakable terms: America would no longer be the victim of unfair trade deals. For decades, the narrative from Trump and those who shared his outlook was that global trade agreements had hollowed out America's manufacturing heartland, shipped good, paying jobs overseas, and left U.S. workers competing against cheaper foreign labor with little to show for it. The remedy, he argued, was straightforward in theory, but seismic in execution: used tariffs as a weapon, not a mere bargaining chip, to force trading partners to open their markets, respect U.S. intellectual property, and stop manipulating their currencies. The United States, as the world's largest economy, had leverage. Trump's position was that this leverage had been squandered by previous administrations too eager to compromise. The trade war, in his telling, was a necessary correction, a tough stance designed to break a cycle of dependency and disadvantage. The first shots were fired against China, with tariffs on steel and aluminum justified under national security provisions. Then came broader measures targeting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, followed by tariffs on products from Europe, Canada, and Mexico when negotiations faltered. Each move was framed as part of a master strategy: pressure foreign economies, until they conceded to terms more favorable to the United States. In this early stage, the tone was almost martial. The language of winning and losing was borrowed directly from the battlefield, casting trade as a zero-sum contest where strength was measured by the size of the deficit reduced or the concessions extracted. Trump told supporters that America was finally standing up for itself, and predicted that foreign nations reliant on access to the U.S. market would quickly fold. That framing, combining economic nationalism with a readiness to endure short-term pain, was the powerful hook that rallied a significant base of political support. In places like the Rust Belt, where factory closures had left scars not just on the economy but on community identity, the idea of fighting back resonated deeply. For many, the tariffs symbolized more than just taxes on imported goods. They were proof that Washington was willing to defend American industry with real consequences for those who took advantage of it. This was the vision at the outset, a bold gamble that, by wielding tariffs as blunt instruments, the United States could rewrite the terms of global trade to its advantage. Whether that vision has paid off, or at what cost, is the central question that continues to shadow the rest of the trade wars story. In the midst of the escalating tariffs, retaliatory measures, and headline-grabbing confrontations with foreign leaders, it is easy to overlook that the Trump administration did secure some tangible gains from its trade war strategy. These tactical wins became a critical talking point for supporters, serving as proof that the confrontational approach was more than just political theater. One of the earliest victories came in the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Trump had long criticized as one of the worst deals ever made. The result was the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, a rebranded and reworked trade pact that included updated labor provisions, stronger protections for intellectual property, and expanded market access for American dairy farmers into Canada's tightly regulated dairy sector. While critics pointed out that many elements of the old NAFTA remained intact, the administration framed the USMCA as evidence that allies could be compelled to modernize agreements under tariff pressure. Another notable example was the so-called Phase 1 trade deal with China, signed in January 2020. After months of punitive tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, China agreed to increase its purchases of U.S. agricultural products, manufactured goods, and energy, and to make commitments on intellectual property protections and forced technology transfers. For struggling American farmers, particularly soybean producers in the Midwest, these purchase commitments were held up as a lifeline. Beyond specific deals, there were narrower industry-specific benefits. The tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, though controversial, provided short-term relief to domestic producers by making foreign alternatives more expensive. This allowed some U.S. steel plants to restart idle operations and bring back a limited number of jobs, at least in the immediate aftermath. In the administration's telling, these developments validated the central thesis of the trade war. that the United States, when willing to endure short-term discomfort, could force even the largest economies to the negotiating table and extract concessions that had eluded more cautious predecessors. The optics of foreign leaders signing revised trade agreements or making purchasing pledges reinforced the image of a president delivering on his promises. However, these tactical wins often came with qualifiers. For instance, while China pledged to increase U.S. imports, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted global supply chains and trade flows, making it difficult for Beijing to meet its targets. Similarly, the USMCA's labor provisions faced questions about enforcement, and some of the benefits for American farmers were offset by earlier losses during the height of the tariff battles. Still, in the political arena, the fact that there were visible agreements, treaties signed, tariffs lifted or reduced after concessions, and sectors that could point to measurable gains was crucial. Supporters saw them as milestones on the road to a fairer trade system. Detractors viewed them as incremental, costly victories that did little to offset the broader economic disruptions. In essence, Trump's trade war did produce tactical wins. They were real, visible, and politically potent, but they were also narrow in scope, time-bound in their impact, and often entangled with the very economic turbulence the war itself had unleashed. While the Trump administration's trade war produced some measurable wins, the economic costs were substantial, diffuse, and in many cases still unfolding long after the initial tariff announcements. For every factory that benefited from temporary relief against foreign competition, there were multiple sectors, often less visible in political speeches, that bore the brunt of retaliation and rising costs. Agriculture was among the hardest hit. When the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, Beijing responded in kind, targeting politically sensitive exports like soybeans, pork, and dairy. American farmers, especially in the Midwest, saw export orders evaporate almost overnight. Grain silos filled to capacity, prices fell, and many were forced to rely on federal aid to stay afloat. The administration's $28 billion farm bailout between 2018 and 2019 was the largest agricultural assistance package in modern history, a level of government intervention rarely associated with the free market ideals the trade war was supposed to protect. Manufacturing supply chains, particularly in industries dependent on imported parts and materials, also suffered. Modern manufacturing is deeply interconnected with components sourced from multiple countries. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other industrial inputs raised production costs for everything from cars to household appliances. Smaller manufacturers, unable to absorb or pass along these costs as easily as corporate giants, faced shrinking profit margins and, in some cases, closures. For consumers, the effects were quieter but constant. Tariffs function as taxes on imports, and while they are paid initially by importers, the costs often trickle down through higher retail prices. Electronics, clothing, and everyday goods that once benefited from global sourcing became noticeably more expensive. A Federal Reserve study estimated that the average U.S. household paid hundreds of dollars more annually as a result of the tariffs, essentially negating some of the benefits from the administration's tax cuts. Financial markets also reacted warily to the ongoing uncertainty. The back and forth of tariff threats and temporary truces introduced volatility that made it harder for businesses to plan investments. Large corporations delayed expansion projects, and global investors sought safer assets, dampening the appetite for long-term bets on U.S. growth. Beyond the tangible costs, there was a subtler structural toll: the erosion of trust in trade relationships that had taken decades to build. Allies like Canada and the European Union bristled at being labeled national security threats under tariff laws, complicating cooperation on unrelated geopolitical issues. Even when new deals were signed, the memory of aggressive tactics lingered, making future negotiations potentially more fraught. These economic costs did not erase the tactical wins, but they reframed the trade war as a balancing act, one in which the benefits for certain industries came at the expense of others, and the short-term victories could be offset by long-term inefficiencies. Supporters argued that such pain was the necessary price of reclaiming leverage. Critics countered that the disruptions were self-inflicted wounds, weakening sectors of the economy that were never the intended targets. The reality was somewhere in between. The trade war redistributed economic pressure rather than eliminating it, creating winners and losers across a deeply interdependent economy. And in a nation where economic narratives often shape political fortunes, those costs were as much about perception as they were about dollars and cents. From the very outset, the Trump administration insisted that the trade war was not merely about economics. It was about sovereignty, leverage, and restoring a sense of fairness in the global marketplace. Officials repeatedly framed the tariffs and retaliatory skirmishes as a calculated investment, a short-term sacrifice meant to yield long-term gains for American workers and industries. The core of this narrative was simple and forceful. For too long, the United States had played by rules that others ignored, and in doing so, it had allowed its own industrial base to wither. According to the administration, trade deficits were not just accounting quirks, they were symptoms of a system in which foreign competitors exploited America's open markets while keeping their own closed or heavily subsidized. Trump and his trade advisors argued that tariffs were the most direct and credible way to push those competitors to the negotiating table. By this logic, economic discomfort was not a policy failure, but an expected phase of tough medicine. Administration officials likened the process to renegotiating a bad contract. One must be willing to walk away, endure tension, and apply pressure until the other party concedes. Tariffs were cast as both a bargaining chip and a demonstration of resolve. In speeches, Trump often reminded audiences that no one had ever fought for the American worker like this, and that the pain some industries felt was the price of reclaiming national dignity in trade. The framing also leaned heavily on historical analogies. Supporters inside the administration compared the trade war to past moments when the U.S. had endured short-term hardship to achieve strategic breakthroughs, such as during the Cold War. They painted tariffs as a modern equivalent of sanctions, tools that could shift global behavior without deploying military force. In this light, bailouts for farmers and targeted relief for affected sectors were not admissions of failure, but proof of loyalty to domestic producers caught in the crossfire. The administration portrayed these measures as a safety net to help Americans weather the storm until better trade terms could be secured. Critics, of course, saw this framing as selective storytelling, but to its base, it reinforced a narrative of purposeful struggle. America under Trump was finally refusing to be taken advantage of, even if that meant enduring higher prices and market volatility in the short run. The promise was that once the dust settled, the United States would stand atop a rebalanced trade system with stronger industries, more favorable agreements, and a restored sense of self-reliance. Whether or not the endgame was clearly defined, the framing itself was politically potent. It recast the conversation from one about tariffs and trade deficits to one about patriotism and resilience. By making the trade war as much about identity as economics, the administration ensured that for many supporters, the debate was not simply, is this working, but are we willing to fight for our place in the world? The reach of the trade war extended far beyond the industries directly targeted by tariffs. Its ripple effects touched the entire economic ecosystem, influencing hiring decisions, investment flows, and the confidence that underpins both business and consumer behavior. The wider impact was not limited to measurable costs. It also reshaped how global partners and domestic stakeholders viewed America's role in the world economy. One of the most immediate consequences was a slowdown in business investment. For large corporations, uncertainty is the enemy of expansion, and the constant cycle of tariff threats, retaliatory measures, and partial truces made long-term planning risky. Projects involving new factories, research facilities, or overseas partnerships were postponed or scaled back. Smaller businesses already operating on thinner margins often had no choice but to halt growth plans altogether. The resulting hesitation dampened hiring, particularly in sectors linked to international supply chains. Financial markets responded with bouts of volatility, reflecting investor unease over the unpredictability of trade policy. Global capital tends to seek stability, and the perception that U.S. trade relationships were in flux prompted some investors to diversify away from American markets. While not catastrophic, this shift was enough to influence stock performance, currency values, and corporate borrowing costs. For small and medium-sized enterprises, the trade war created a unique set of challenges. Unlike multinational corporations, these businesses lacked the resources to restructure supply chains quickly or absorb prolonged cost increases. Many were forced to choose between passing costs on to customers, risking reduced sales, or accepting lower profit margins. In industries like specialty manufacturing or niche retail, these pressures sometimes proved unsustainable. The effects were also felt in less tangible but equally important ways. Long-standing allies such as Canada, the European Union, and Japan found themselves on the receiving end of tariffs justified under national security provisions. This approach bruised diplomatic relationships and complicated cooperation on unrelated issues, from defense to climate policy. Even after new agreements were reached, the memory of abrupt tariff impositions lingered, introducing a layer of mistrust into future negotiations. On the consumer side, Higher prices for imported goods were only part of the story. The trade war altered the competitive landscape in certain sectors, sometimes reducing product variety or delaying the release of new technologies. Companies that relied on just in-time inventory systems, for example, faced supply disruptions that rippled into shipping delays and stock shortages. Perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. For decades, global trade had operated under a set of relatively stable rules, and the United States was viewed as a champion of open markets. The trade war signaled a departure from that role, with America positioning itself as a more aggressive, less predictable player. Supporters argued this was a necessary recalibration, showing that the country would no longer accept disadvantageous arrangements. Critics worried it undermined the cooperative frameworks that had helped prevent major trade conflicts for generations. In the end, the wider impact of Trump's trade war was a complex blend of economic strain, strategic recalibration, and shifting perceptions at home and abroad that may shape the global trading order for years to come. In any conflict, military, political, or economic, the definition of victory is as important as the outcome itself. In the case of Trump's trade war, that definition was both elusive and evolving. Was winning a matter of reducing the trade deficit, bringing back manufacturing jobs, forcing foreign powers to change their economic practices? Or was it, as the administration sometimes implied, simply proving that the United States would fight for better terms? The difficulty in defining victory stemmed from the fact that trade wars are not like traditional wars with clear surrender ceremonies or peace treaties. Economic conflicts tend to resolve in stages, with partial agreements, temporary truces, and concessions that may be open to interpretation. In some cases, the United States secured new trade deals, such as the USVI, or commitments from China to purchase billions in U.S. goods. These were tangible outcomes that the administration heralded as proof of success. Yet, they often fell short of addressing the deeper structural issues that had been central to the trade war's justification, such as intellectual property theft or state subsidies in foreign economies. For supporters, victory could be claimed in the mere act of challenging a system they saw as unfair. The tariffs, in their view, signaled a willingness to reject business as usual and confront powerful trading partners without flinching. Even incremental concessions, they argued, represented progress toward a fairer playing field. In political rallies, Trump often pointed to factories reopening or farms receiving new export orders as signs that America was winning. Critics, however, set the bar higher. They argued that any true victory should be measured by sustained long-term gains, more jobs, higher wages, and a lasting shift in trade practices by foreign competitors. From this perspective, many of the so-called wins were either temporary, offset by retaliatory damage, or achievable without the economic disruption of a full-scale trade war. There was also the question of opportunity cost. Even if the trade war secured better terms in some areas, was the disruption worth it? The billions in federal aid to farmers, the higher consumer prices, and the supply chain volatility all represented economic resources that might have been used elsewhere. If victory came at the expense of economic stability or global goodwill, some argued it was a hollow one. Ultimately, the definition of winning in Trump's trade war was highly subjective, shaped less by neutral metrics than by political affiliation and economic philosophy. For the administration and its supporters, the trade war was a statement of national resolve, and any movement toward more favorable trade agreements was a win. For its detractors, the lack of clear, lasting economic benefits made it difficult to declare success. In this ambiguity lies the enduring question: if victory cannot be measured by a stable set of economic indicators, does it remain a matter of perception? And if so, perhaps the trade war's outcome will be judged not by its immediate results, but by whether it set a precedent for how America engages with the world in future economic battles. The Trump trade war left behind a paradox, one that makes it difficult to label the effort a straightforward success or failure. On one hand, the United States gained undeniable leverage, extracting concessions from key trading partners and placing economic pressure on rivals like China in ways few previous administrations had attempted. On the other hand, the very tools used to secure those gains, tariffs, retaliatory battles, and public brinkmanship, created structural frictions that could take years to unwind. This paradox was evident in the agricultural sector. The Phase 1 deal with China promised a surge in purchases of U.S. farm goods, which was welcomed by farmers who had suffered through years of shrinking export markets. Yet many of those markets had already shifted to competitors during the height of the dispute. Soybean contracts, once destined for China, were now going to Brazil, Pork buyers had forged new relationships with European suppliers. Even after agreements were reached, rebuilding lost market share proved far more challenging than securing the initial commitments on paper. Manufacturing told a similar story. Tariffs on steel and aluminum gave domestic producers a temporary price advantage, helping some facilities reopen and rehire workers. But the higher input costs rippled through industries that relied on those metals. Automakers, construction equipment manufacturers, and appliance companies raising prices and eroding competitiveness. In effect, the policy both protected and punished different parts of the same economic ecosystem. There was also a geopolitical dimension to the paradox. By demonstrating a willingness to disrupt global trade flows, the United States reminded the world of its economic clout. Countries accustomed to predictable U.S. trade policy now understood that access to the American market could no longer be taken for granted. Yet this newfound leverage came at the expense of trust. Allies and adversaries alike began exploring ways to diversify away from U.S.-centered supply chains, a move that could reduce America's influence in the long term. Even the trade deficit, the metric Trump often cited as a measure of unfairness, reflected the complexity of the results. While the deficit with certain countries narrowed, the overall U.S. trade deficit hit record highs during parts of the trade war. Driven by strong domestic demand and shifts in sourcing rather than a clear win in manufacturing output, the paradox deepened when viewed through the lens of domestic politics. For Trump's base, the trade war was proof of a president willing to fight battles others had avoided, regardless of cost. For opponents, it was a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of wielding economic power without a long-term plan for resolution. Both interpretations were grounded in real data points, yet they led to entirely different conclusions. In the end, the trade war achieved a set of mixed outcomes, visible wins that energized political supporters, and hidden costs that experts warned could erode competitiveness over time. It was a strategy that simultaneously demonstrated America's economic strength and exposed its vulnerabilities. A reminder that in a globalized economy, victory is rarely absolute, and the price of leverage can be just as lasting as the leverage itself. The trade war was never just about tariffs or deficits, or even the price of soybeans in Shanghai. It was about how the United States sees itself in a world where economic power is as decisive as military might. Donald Trump's approach proved that America could still shake the foundations of the global trading system, but it also revealed how deeply intertwined our prosperity is with that system. Whether you call it victory or a costly experiment depends on which ledger you read, the one showing hard-won concessions or the one tallying lost markets, higher prices, and frayed alliances. Perhaps the real question is not did we win, but what did we change and what did it cost to change it? Because in the end, trade wars, like all wars, are measured not just by the ground gained, but by the ground that can never be recovered. And on that battlefield, America's fight is far from over.